Last time we spoke about the First Guangdong-Guangxi War. The First Anhui-Zhuli War not only affected northern China, it also put into motion many events in the south. Viceroy Lu Rongting, working for Duan Shire and his Anhui clique, was sent south to take over the position as governor of Guangdong. Yet those in the Guangdong clique wanted nothing to do with the north, nor with Lu Rongting, and this led to a bitter struggle emerged between the southern cliques, all seeking to influence the Guangzhou southern government. Forces from Guizhou, Guangxi, and Yunnan invaded Guangdong, and it looked like they were about to have their way. That was until Chen Jiongming entered the scene. Chen Jiongming led the Guangdong clique beside the common people of the province to rid themselves of the invaders, resulting in the First Guangdong-Guangxi War. This resulted in the near annihilation of the old Guangxi clique, and the return of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, Guangzhou. This episode is The Spirit Soldiers' Rebellions. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia. Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Check out my series on the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. It's basically like a sneak peek into the future of this podcast series. Also, please check out my booming Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to my exclusive Patreon podcast. A big thanks to everyone who's already joined up. Hey guys, before we jump into it, I just want to acknowledge that this is technically episode 100 for the Fall and Rise of China podcast. Sheesh. A big thanks to all of you who've survived this far into this wild story about China's century of humiliation. You guys are all awesome. Another little piece of history for you. The original title I wanted for this podcast series was China's Century of Humiliation. But my bosses thought that was a bit too rough. And I think the Fall and Rise of China does equate it better. Also, unfortunately, because this podcast is technically stuck in a larger series, that being the Age of Conquest, it's actually very hard to find, I imagine. As much as I call it the Fall and Rise of China podcast, technically it will be found under the Age of Conquest. But, and I can't give away too much, some stuff is going to change in the future, and I think this podcast is going to expand even more. Now, perhaps if you've got a moment, could you do me a huge favor? Unlike YouTube with a built-in comment section, it's actually nearly impossible to get feedback for audio podcasts. Honestly, if you get a second, could you toss some feedback about what you like, what you don't like about this specific podcast? And, give me any suggestions going forward. Maybe you want to suggest a new series. In order to do so, honestly, there's a variety of ways you can do it. But you could literally just go over to the Pacific War channel, where you will find at the top right corner a Discord server. So you can join my Pacific War Discord server and literally just, in any of the chat rooms, tell me your thoughts. And if you don't want to go over to the Discord, you can literally check out any of my videos on YouTube at the Pacific War channel. Just comment whatever and say you came from the Fall and Rise of China podcast. Or message me over at the Kings and Generals Discord server. Or for those old school cats out there, if you go over to my YouTube channel, you will find I do have an email address associated with it, so you can email me. But stating that, thanks again, let's get on with the show. As one can imagine, China's warlord era was not something one would refer to as stable. After the absolute mess Yuan Shikai made before his death, he basically provided the perfect environment for any wannabe strongmen to compete for their place amongst the warlords. The warlords fleeced their respective regions of control to pay for their private armies. They would overly tax, steal away funds, and get involved in just about any means to acquire more money to pay their soldiers. Even after fleecing the population, these warlords would then allow their troops to plunder, rape, and enslave. Combine this with the incredible amount of regional wars, plus natural disasters, famine, and an insane rise in banditry. It was not that great a time to live in China, to say the least. Some regions suffered more than others. The less developed provinces, the more remote areas of China, typically in the center, south and west, were hit the worst. Here the common people were poor, more isolated, and when major crises occurred, they were far less likely to see any outside assistance. The warlord armies in these regions were less equipped, less fed, less disciplined compared to their northern or coastal counterparts. The troops of these warlords treated the citizenry especially bad. As a result of the unrelenting hardship, the peasants of these parts of China perceived the warlord soldiers, the tax collectors, and the foreign state agents as literal parasites. Hell, wouldn't you? In a rather vain attempt to rid themselves of these parasites, the peasants launched a large number of uprisings, riots, and protests. Some were tiny village squabbles, others could bring down warlords. They often came directly after a bad harvest season. Some, but not all, saw peasants join secret societies, acting as self-defense forces. Yes, it sounds exactly like the Yihu Tuan, all over again. Yet in most cases, these peasant groups were not coordinated enough to really make a dent. More often than not, warlords simply crushed them. After the National Protection War against Yuan Shikai, the provinces of Hubei and Sichuan fell into miserable chaos. As we've talked about in the previous episode, where I introduced the southern warlords, Sichuan province literally was cut up into pieces and dominated by a large number of what I would call petty warlords. Some of these petty warlords had little more than a few villages under their thumb. Others led armies in the several tens of thousands. The situation in Hubei was not as bad, but comparable, seeing numerous warlords battle another, resulting in hundreds of thousands of soldiers, militiamen, and bandits roaming both provinces. To complicate things further, these petty warlords, in a means to try and bolster themselves, often flirted with the Beiyang government. They did so similar to how, in the last episode, we saw figures trying to negotiate the North-South resolutions. Basically, they would acknowledge the authority of the Beiyang government in order for things in return. The two provinces were also affected by socio-ethnic divisions. Within the valley and plains of Sichuan and Hubei were mostly Han Chinese. But in the highlands, there were many non-Han, such as Miao, Tujia. For those interested, the Miao people spoke Huangik, a subfamily of the Hmong-Mian languages. Something notable about the Miao people is how their women historically exercised more independence, especially in terms of socio-political mobility. Unlike the majority of Asian cultures at the time, Miao women had the freedom to choose the men that they wanted to marry. The Tujia people spoke Tujia, a Sino-Tibetan language, and they were at the zenith of their power under the Ming dynasty. During the Qing dynasty, the Manchu basically adopted a carrot-and-stick approach to the Tujia people, gifting the compliant chieftains over the non-compliant ones. The Tujia resented any central body trying to exert control over them, and during the Taiping Rebellion, many flocked to the Taiping. These non-Han groups felt oppressed and historically had always resisted Han immigration into their lands. The Highlanders were much more versed in organized self-defense forces and thus more prone to uprisings. The environments these people lived in were the type to foster ancestral worship and the belief in magic, spiritualism, possession, and such. Within the context of these people struggling for further autonomy, this led to the development of spirit soldiers. Similar to the Yihu Tuan, this was the belief people could summon divine beings that would fight alongside or possess them, granting them power. These beliefs were also part of a messianic and apocalyptic movement. Think of the White Lotus apocalypse. There were many who believed the spirit soldiers would help establish a new and fair rule over Earth. In 1920, there was a large power vacuum that hit western Hubei province. A 30,000-strong army commanded by the warlords Li Tiancai, Bao Wenwei, Lan Tianwei, and Wang Tiangzong came into the area. The reason for this was because Wang Zhenyuan, the governor of Hubei, had evicted them from the Enshi-Hufeng area. Having suffered so greatly, the peasants of Hubei and Sichuan became increasingly discontent in 1920. Major conflicts soon emerged. A group of Taoist priests began a spiritual movement with a militant wing behind it. They were fighting against overtaxation in Yichuan of Hubei province, and the abuses upon them by local warlords. In the beginning, they were no more than 100 people chanting the slogan, "Kill the warlords, and out with the rotten officials and loafers." Their slogans were very appealing, and as more people joined up, the priests began telling them that they could bless them to become spirit soldiers through magical rituals. Again, I'm going to keep saying this, it's very similar to the Yuan. These rituals consisted of the acts of drinking special potions or consuming the ashes of various things like burnt amulets. Supposedly, this would make them spirit soldiers invulnerable to gunfire and raise their bravery. So yeah, it really does feel like the Boxer Movement 2.0. Of course, these young males were emboldened and they felt that they could mount a serious rebellion against the warlord troops, who were very, and I mean very better armed. The spirit soldiers typically were armed with melee weapons, like spears or a dao. They quickly overran Sichuan County and killed the local magistrate there. Upon that success, further uprisings sprang up like wildfire. After taking Sichuan, it is estimated the spirit soldiers numbered over 10,000, and they would only continue to grow. Given their numbers, they were gradually beginning to organize themselves seriously, though they would still operate in numerous cells. They never really fully unified. 3 main spirit armies emerged alongside countless militias. They rarely coordinated, lacked real military training, had very few firearms and no uniforms, but nonetheless they tried to act like real armies. They implemented military ranks and identified as such with yellow bands around their left hand's middle finger, the yellow color being the official movement color. Similar to the Taiping Rebellion, which they definitely took inspiration from. Major spirit armies and militias wore distinct colors based on their region. For example, in western Hubei, they wore red turbans and sashes. Many also carried red flags with their leaders' names inscribed upon them or with slogans. Some of these slogans were about, quote, "Heavenly kingdoms being established on earth." So yes, Hong Xiuquan would approve. These spirit soldier groups did not want to seize power, nor did they have any real revolutionary ideology. Even from a class point of view, they weren't exactly championing the impoverished or anything. When they took over counties, they did not change the county social order. Typically, they stormed a county, killed or replaced the magistrate with someone they deemed to be a fair person. Ironically, this often led to an even more corrupt person taking the magistrate position, making the lives of people worse. But you know what? When these spirit soldiers showed up to your county, as a regular peasant, you were probably pretty happy about it, because anything was better than being ruled by a warlord. The great thing about the spirit armies was when they came to your town, they fought the tax collectors and the rent collectors, who were often working alongside warlord troops and bandits. It was said, under spirit rule, the people could finally travel around unarmed without fear. Now soldiers, no matter what god or spirit resides within them, need to eat. Thus money was required. To make ends meet, the spirit armies fought bandits and warlords and seized control over salt and opium trade routes running from Sichuan and Guizhou through the western parts of Hubei. Just like the Yuan, the spirit soldiers also persecuted Christians and foreigners. Most of them were under the belief the Western modernization efforts and Christianity as a whole were the reason for all of China's troubles. Once the Spirit Soldier Rebellion began to see tens of thousands enlist, they gradually advanced west into Sichuan province. There lies a regional trade hub, the city of Wanzhou, lying on the upper reaches of the 3 gorges of the Yangtze River. In the later part of 1920, a spirit army from Sichuan approached Wanzhou, spreading slogans of their movement, such as, "Stand against rents and taxes, kill the gray dogs." Gray dogs referring to the warlord troops. Now, they did not attack Wanzhou. Instead, they allowed members to infiltrate the city and the local towns to mass recruit. After a few months, they managed to gain about 5,000 new spirit soldiers. They also set up a military HQ at a local temple dedicated to Yama. For those unaware, Yama is a deity shared by Hindus and Buddhists. This temple in particular was dedicated to the Buddhist variety of Yama. Yama here is regarded as one of the 20 to 24 devas, a group of protected Dharma palace. If you were a spirit soldier, it would be the ideal location to set up shop. It's like plus 20 to spirituality and such. They were armed mostly with bamboo spears when they assaulted Wanzhou on March the 5th of 1921. The assault was performed in two waves of roughly 2,000 spirit soldiers each. Despite being armed with firearms, the local warlord troops were terrified by the tenacity of the spirit soldiers, who performed very much like the boxers. They fought bare-chested, unafraid of bullets, some performed martial arts and incantations. Just like what happened to the Qing militias and the Green Standard troops in 1900, the warlord troops were terrified the spirit soldiers might actually be wielding magic, and soon routed, fleeing Wanzhou's outskirts to hide behind fortified walls in the inner city. The spirit troops stormed through Wanzhou, quickly seizing most of the city. However, unlike the warlord army, who would have plundered and left or heavily fortified the city, well, the spirit army was simply not that kind of army. As soon as they took the footholds within, they began performing public incantations and rituals. Basically, they were doing exactly like the boxers had done. However, the boxers had been facing governmental forces who were not really keen on fighting back. For the spirit soldiers, their enemy were warlords, who relied on fleecing the population, and Wanzhou was a major trade center, prime real estate. The warlord forces fortified parts of the inner city, hid behind the walls where the spirit troops could simply not breach, nor did they even try to do so. After 3 days, the warlord leaders slapped their troops around, telling them not to be afraid of magic, and they launched a counterattack on the 8th. That day saw brutal street-to-street fighting, which did benefit the melee-wielding spirit warriors, but guns certainly would win the day. After an entire day of battle, the spirit forces were pushed out of the city. Nearly 500 were killed during this battle, the majority being spirit soldiers. On the 12th, the warlord, Chou Fuyu, after receiving distress requests for help, arrived to Wanzhou with reinforcements. Once he figured out they were holding up at the Yama Temple, he organized an offensive against their HQ. Chou Fuyu's forces stormed the temple, massacring over 1,000 of them. Chou Fuyu's men specifically hunted down their leadership, executing them publicly to send a message. After witnessing the carnage, the spirit army collapsed and fled the Wanzhou area, swiftly. Most would return to civilian life, though others would fight for another day. Those who chose to keep championing the cause formed small militia groups that honestly were more akin to Honghuzi. Local officials in Hubei and Sichuan would refer to them as such. The whole country districts were laid waste by these rebels who plundered wherever they went. The spirit militias did not attempt to seize any significant towns or cities. They simply stormed them, hunting for Christians and foreigners before moving on to the next. They would do this for years in the Hubei-Sichuan region, where their power bases were located along the border area. Now, despite the major setback at Wanzhou, the spirit armies would continue to expand, but instead of heading westwards into Sichuan, they turned back into Hubei. This had a large effect on the Hubei-based warlords who sometimes were pushed out of their spheres of influence. Spirit armies seized Yichang, Badong, Xi'an, Anshi, and countless other counties. One spirit leader, a farmer's workhand named Yuan, declared himself the new Jade Emperor, and he attempted to seize most of western Hubei. From around 1920 to 1922, acting as the said emperor, he issued numerous edicts. For the most part, he led a campaign against pretty much every class imaginable: students, farmers, business owners, landowners, merchants, the military, workers, missionaries, and more. He called for the killing of Christians, placing blame on them for all of China's problems, promising his followers once the Christians were gone, China would be at peace. There were those amongst his flock and others who were Ming loyalists, the age-old secret society types trying to restore the Ming dynasty. Similar to the wannabe Jade Emperor's belief that getting rid of Christianity would save China from their plight, the Ming loyalists saw the Ming dynasty as the very golden age of China that needed to be re-ushered in. The spirit armies were largely successful because of the fighting amongst the warlords of Hubei, and to a lesser extent, Sichuan. Western Hubei in particular was ripe with chaos, for there was not only spirit armies and warlord armies, there were also large groups of Honghuzi roaming the region. Now, I could cut this story about the spirit soldiers here, but instead I will try not to allude to things in the future too much, because I do want to continue. But around 1921, armies of the Zhuli clique began to invade Hubei and Sichuan from their power base in Hunan province. The Zhuli armies soon fought battles against both Hubei and Sichuan warlord armies, and they were gradually forced back north. In the process, some Sichuan warlords seized Baodong, Zugui, and Xingshan, fleecing the populations for all that they were worth before departing. The Sichuan warlord Yang Sen notably seized Lichuan and Jianxu in October of 1921. He would hold them until February of 1923. Yang Sen was a Taoist master and an avid polygamist. He met the Taoist master Li Chengyuan, who claimed he had lived to be 250 years old. Yes, he was quite famous. Hell, Wu Peifu, while leading the Zhuli clique, would take Li Qiyuan into his home, trying to discover his secret method of living for so long. Li Qiyuan died in 1933, but he claimed to have produced over 200 descendants and 24 wives over the course of his very long life. Yang Sen wrote a famous book after his death titled A Factual Account of the 250-Year-Old Good Luck Man. Within the book, he described Li Qingyuan as, quote, "He has good eyesight and a brisk stride. Li stands 7 feet tall, has very long fingernails, and a ruddy complexion." Allegedly, Li was born in Qijiang County of Sichuan Province back in 1677. At the age of 13, he embarked on a life of gathering herbs in the mountains, amongst 3 elders of his village. At 51 years of age, he served as a topography advisor in the army of General Yuan. At 78, he retired from military service after fighting in a battle at the Golden River, whence he returned to a life of gathering herbs on the snow mountain of Sichuan Province. Due to his military service under Yuan, the government sent him a document congratulating him on his 100th birthday, and this was done again on his 150th and 200th. In 1908, Li co-wrote a book with a disciple of his, Yang Heshuan, called The Secrets of Li Qingyuan's Immortality. In 1920, General Shang Yahe interviewed Li, and he published an article about him at the Nanjing University. In 1926, Wu Peifu would take him to his home, as I had said, and Li took up a job teaching at the Beijing University's Meditation Society branch. 1927, General Yang Sen invited Li to Wanzhou, where the first known photograph of the man was taken. So if you go and Google him, you can see it. Now, after hearing about the famous 200-plus-year-old man, General Chiang Kai-shek requested he visit him in Nanjing. However, when Yang Sen sent envoys to find Li at his hometown of Qianjiang, his current wife and disciples broke the news he had died, and the year was apparently 1928. Now, you might be raising an eyebrow. Yes, after his supposed death, newspapers began writing pieces claiming he actually died in 1929, 1930. The last was reported in 1933. No one has ever verified exactly when or how he died. They all just listed as natural cause. Now, about this fascinating case of his age, Li Qingyuan claimed he had been born in 1736. It was a professor at Chengdu University, Wu Chengchui, who asserted he was born in 1676. According to an article by the New York Times in 1930, Wu discovered imperial records from 1827 congratulating Li on his 150th birthday, then another for his 200th birthday in 1877. In another New York Times article from 1928, correspondents wrote that many of the old men of Li's village asserted that their grandfathers all knew him as a young boy and that he had been a grown man at the time. Many researchers have also pointed out that his claim to be 256 years of age was also a multiple of 8, considered a lucky number in Chinese culture. Researchers have also pointed out the prevalence of such myths, as extreme old age is a very common one in China and the Far East. They believe he was just telling a tall tale like countless others before him. One of Li's disciples, Master Dai Lu, said of his master, when Li was 130 years old, he encountered an old hermit in the mountains claiming to be 500 years old. This old hermit taught him Ba Guai Zhang, the style of martial arts of Qigong. These are breathing, meditation, and posturing exercises. Alongside dietary habits, all combined, this is what gave the hermit his longevity. Du Le would say, "His master said that his longevity is due to the fact that he performed the exercises every day, regularly, correctly, and with sincerity, for 120 years. Sorry for getting so sidetracked, but this is an extremely fascinating story. Thought it would be just fun to go through it. So back over with General Yang Sen. After he had seized Lichuan and Jianshu, he would be involved in numerous wars in Sichuan. He often fought with the governor of Sichuan province, Xiong Kuwu, who was gradually defeated by 1923, whereupon he took his armies into western Hubei. Yang Sen, amongst other warlords, exploited the absence of Xiong Kuwu, and he invaded Sichuan province. The departure of Xiong Kuwu from Sichuan province also allowed petty warlords like Kong Jian to seize territory and for a large Hangguzi army led by Liao Yongren to invade Yuxiang. Things got so bad for Xiong Kuwu, he turned to a very unlikely group to form an alliance, the Spirit Soldiers. Xiong Kuwu allied with the Spirit armies encamped at Enshu and Hufang. In 1924, a large part of Xiong Kuwu's army were advancing through the Wu Valley, trying to link up with him. The Wu Valley was a strategic stronghold for the Spirit armies, thus in order to gain free passage, he had to join up with them. Chaos would reign supreme in both Hubei and Sichuan for many years, not aided much by General Yang Sen, who took a governorship over Sichuan. Once he became governor, he provoked most of his loose allies to form a coalition to oust him from his position by early 1925. Just like Xiong Kuwu, now it was Yang Sen retreating west into Hubei, eventually forming a base at Baodong. One of his opponents, the petty warlord Yuan Zuming, a member of the Guizhou clique, invaded the region and seized Lichuan and Xinan, before setting his eyes on Hefeng. Meanwhile, the Spirit armies, bolstered by Xiong Kuwu, spread again into Sichuan, where they were offering protection to locals from warlord troops and the Hangguzi. They fought a large battle around Wangying, and allegedly they turned the local river crimson with blood. By early 1926, the Spirit movement had surged past 100,000 troops. They dominated over 40 counties in Hubei. Yet, they still were never fully centralized as an organization. Rarely they coordinated between armies and different groups. They were not heavily armed with firearms either. Honestly, by becoming a larger force, and by becoming more sedentary, it actually spelt their doom. While they were smaller and more mobile, they were harder to catch and less appetizing to warlord armies. Now they were fully on the menu. In 1926, 3 divisions of warlord troops were set against them. The Spirit armies were absolutely crushed in waves of one-sided battles. Their leaders were hunted down and executed. That is, if they did not die on the battlefield or simply off themselves prior to being caught. Yet 1926 would bring an entirely new element at play. It was, of course, the Northern Expedition. It was such a colossal event, it would save the Spirit soldiers from complete annihilation. Again, and I know I say this a lot, I don't want to give anything away, but the Northern Expedition would affect both Yang Sen and Xiong Kuwu, and by proxy the areas they controlled. This would cause further chaos in Hubei and Sichuan, which in turn would be exploited by countless other figures. For example, a large Hangguzi army, like I had mentioned, led by Liao Yongren, perhaps 20,000 men strong, or more, ran rampant in both provinces. Hangguzi loved to follow behind warlord armies, exploiting areas they passed through since the rival warlords would have been kicked out. With the Northern Expedition brushing aside countless warlords in the area, both Hangguzi and Spirit soldiers expanded. Some Spirit soldiers even decided to join up with a new group hitting the scene, the Red Armies. The CCP were falling into a war with the KMT, and they began to latch on to anyone who would join up with them. 2 prominent CCP figures, Xu Xiangxian and Hu Long, worked with the Spirit soldiers. Hu Long came to view them as nothing more than another version of Hangguzi, but he acknowledged they wanted to protect the local people, which was admirable. Their quasi-alliance allowed the Spirit soldiers to expand into northern and central Sichuan, western Henan, and eastern Guizhou well into the 1930s. Despite the incredible amount of wars that would occur over the decades, the last known Spirit Army rebellion would actually take place in February of 1959. As you can imagine, it was an anti-communist uprising that occurred in Sichuan County of Hunan Province. This was directly a result of Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, enacted the year prior. For those who don't know, the Great Leap Forward encompassed a change of pretty much all aspects of Chinese society, and it was disastrous to say the least. Mao Zedong sought to reconstruct the entire nation from an agrarian economy into a real industrialized society, but on a fast-forward mode. He did so via people's communes, while decreeing every possible effort to increase grain yield must be done so that they could bring industry to rural China. This resulted in one of the worst man-made famines in history. Alongside this came economic disaster, unbelievable governmental abuses upon the people. An estimated 15 to maybe 55 million people would die. Many resisted the government's actions, but the government had decreed no one would leave their village or farms. Thus, it made it extremely difficult to coordinate an actual resistance movement. Desperate peasants tried to resist, alongside countless secret societies. Numerous rebellions broke out, but they were all quite small in scale. Armed resistance broke out in Hunan in 1959, where large bandit groups began to steal weapons from armories and attacked major roadways. A secret society known as the Shenbingtuan, the Regiment of Spirit Soldiers, gathered 1,200 fighters from Hubei, Sichuan, and Shaanxi, and began to attack government officers in Sichuan County. It took the Red Army roughly 20 days to quell the uprising. And with that, thus truly ended the Spirit Soldier movement. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Please do me a huge favor and check out my episodes on the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Honestly, I poured my heart into them. As I scoured YouTube to see what other YouTubers had covered, it seems that no one's ever covered that event in depth, so I really wanted to shed some light on it. Also, please check out my booming Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get full access to all of my exclusive Patreon podcasts. And again, I just want to say a big shout out to you guys from this specific podcast, because I've had a lot of members join up recently and they said they came from the Fall and Rise of China podcast. Thanks again. The Spirit Soldier movement was a drop in the bucket for China's warlord era. They were a group amongst many others who tried to navigate a very cruel world. As comedic as they may have come off, they were brave people who were trying to protect the population from what they deemed to be villains. Many became twisted as a result.